Welcome to Faith and Lit, a podcast exploring the intersection of books and belief. I'm your hostess, Xandra Carroll. Our current series is Talking Tolkien. This week, we're looking at Tolkien's tremendous creativity, and I'm joined again by Kasey Leander and Dr. Simon Barry. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Faith and Lit, where we are discussing the intersection of literature and belief. Today, we're going to be continuing our series, Talking Tolkien, where we're exploring the ideas of that great man who created literary masterpieces that have been enjoyed for generations. And today's topic is creativity. I'm joined again by Christian apologist Kasey Leander and Tolkienologist, if we could call him, Dr. Simon Barry. So to start off, I think all three of us have been writers for a long time. Kasey helped me edit my most recent novel. Simon, you've just finished your most recent manuscript just some weeks ago. And I think we can all agree that the creative process is just incredibly hard, right? I mean, in fact, it's a bit grueling. It's a bit like having a baby. Not that I would know. And according to the laws of biology, probably neither of you really know either. But anyways, Tolkien pressed on, right? Even when he was completely misunderstood by his peers, he never lost that creativity and he never lost that creative energy. So I guess just one thing that I've been wondering is what kept him going and why didn't he give up when so many others would have? I mean, if I was in his position, I probably would have given up long before he did and just sort of allowed my creativity to be stifled by all the criticism.
Well, I think it's a great question, and it echoes what we talked about last time, the perseverance, one of the great virtues of Tolkien himself and of his characters. But I think when we think about Tolkien's creativity, it's important to know the audience for whom you are creating. And I don't think Tolkien was ever really creating for the wider audience, for the popular audience. There's a great line in the introduction to the later editions of Lord of the Rings where he says something along the lines of, many have been very critical of this work, a fact which does not concern me very much as I have the same opinion of their work, or at least of the works that they evidently prefer. The purpose of this work was for a teller of tales to try his hand at something a little longer. In other words, Tolkien wasn't writing because he wanted to be an author. He already had a full-time job as a professor of English literature. Tolkien was writing for the joy of writing, for his own interest, because he had delighted in being creative, because he valued creativity and he wanted to set down what he had created. The Hobbit, his first book was, or his first published book, was also, I think, coming out of the stories he told for his son. So he started wanting to bring delight to those nearest to him, and then was persuaded to see if anyone would publish it. But when people criticised his work, it seems to have been water off a duck's back. His self-esteem was fairly robust, and he didn't really care what other people thought because he wasn't creating for them. They weren't his audience.
That's a good point.
I find that particularly... Sorry, Xandra.
No, I said that's a good point, and then I was just going to say, Kasey, what are your thoughts?
Oh, I find that particularly amazing given the success of his works in his own lifetime. That almost by not caring about what other people thought, he ended up making something that really gripped the public imagination.
I think this is one of... Oh, sorry.
That's okay. We're just stepping all over each other this morning. That's all right. Simon, you actually mentioned in another one of your articles that Tolkien was incredibly hard on himself. You mentioned that in an article actually about Tolkien's creativity that you published recently. And so I was interested by that. Why do you think that may have been? I mean, obviously he didn't care what his critics thought, but he was, in a sense, a critic. Indeed, the harshest of them all.
Yes, I think this brings us actually to a very interesting and little known work of Tolkien, which I think is the one you're referring to correct me if I'm wrong, which is Leaf by Niggle. And not many people have read this little, it's a short story really, but I very much suspect it's an autobiographical allegory, a depiction at least of the creative process as Tolkien experienced it. And it concerns a chap called Niggle, of course an older English term for a niggle is sort of a thought that won't go away, something that you just can't get rid of, which is perhaps significant. Because Niggle is described as a very ordinary and slightly ineffectual little man who one day has this idea to do a painting, and he has a vision of a beautiful tree which he decides to paint. And he sort of potters around in his shed for decades, and all he ever really manages to paint is a leaf and a little bit of a branch. It's incredibly incomplete. And then he has to go away on a journey, and he's been so busy with his painting he hasn't prepared for the journey and gets into trouble when he arrived, which seems to be an image of death and not being prepared for death and judgment. But the judges who receive him, or the judge who receives him, identify his leaf and say, well, it's not much, but he did something good. Let's give him a bit more of a chance. And he's sent away to paint the whole tree. And ultimately he paints the whole tree, and people arriving in this new destination go and see it, and it helps prepare them for their journey into the mountain, up the mountain, which seems to be a figure of heaven in the beatific vision. So Tolkien depicts here a creator who has a great creative vision, and what he manages to create is only a tiny bit of it. But that little bit, done well and faithfully, has value and potential, so much so that when it's taken on in the new world, it becomes something transcendent, something that prepares people for meeting with God himself. Now, if that's in any way autobiographical, and as I say, I suspect there's a little bit of that to it, then it seems quite shocking that Tolkien, who wrote the most popular work of fiction in human history, arguably, certainly in the last 100 years, viewed his work as one leaf of a tree, something so tiny and incomplete. But at the same time, even the most incomplete bit of earthly creativity had the potential to have heavenly value when it was developed and put to use in the right way. And I think that speaks to both the very critical eye, in some ways, Tolkien had, and on the other hand, the tremendous value he assigned to creativity. All he managed to do was paint one leaf of a tree, but even one leaf of a tree could have huge potential. And it also, of course, points a little bit to another dimension of who his audience was. He was not creating for people, but he was perhaps creating for the one who he believed had given him his creativity.
And of course, that one leaf on the tree included, no less than 3 separate languages. I just, sometimes when I just started reading Unfinished Tales, actually for the first time, and it's blowing my mind just how much work he did put out on Middle-earth. It's got an entire comprehensive history, and cosmology and mythology. And so that one leaf was really complex for Tolkien.
It was one leaf, but one leaf done really well. And I think that's another element of the Niggle story. It's better to have one leaf really done well than a whole bough done badly. And I mean, the trend for the modern author is to create a whole series of books that can be licensed and draw the author in, draw the reader in, and so on. And the great authors of our own day mostly write long series. Tolkien wrote very few books, at least that were published in his lifetime. But what he wrote was deep and thought through and has stood the test of time.
Yes, I mean, on the assumption that what Tolkien wrote was allegorical in some way, do you think that suggests that he felt as though there was a charge that could be brought against him, that he hadn't used his time well, that he hadn't prepared for this journey, so to speak? Do you think he felt that and wrestled with that internally in some ways?
Yeah, I mean, when you start psychoanalyzing a person of history, it's always a rather dangerous road to walk down, and we need to put that caveat out there. I mean, Tolkien, I think, was very much operating within a traditional Roman Catholic understanding of death and judgment, in which it's very important to be prepared for death. And if you haven't been properly prepared, you're going to spend a lot more time in purgatory. And that's very much the story of Niggle. And I think if anyone actually stops and asks the question, if I was being judged by my work and my works, how prepared am I to stand before God tomorrow and be judged for my life and how I've used all the gifts of time and energy and creativity and intellect and education that He's given me? I don't think any of us would say we felt prepared if we were being judged by what we've done. And I think that's where that comes from for Tolkien, is an awareness that while he might have used his time better than some, he still hadn't used it rightly. No one who walks this earth has. Now there's more to be told in that story, and I think we're going to touch upon it either today or in later sessions when we talk about the happy ending for Tolkien. But I think that's where some of that sense of unpreparedness came from, an awareness of his own moral failings.
He took the question seriously, in other words.
Very much so. He wasn't afraid to be honest about his own shortcomings.
I think that's really interesting in the fact that, you know, we as creators have this vision for creation that is so huge and massive because we look around at the creation around us. I mean, I'm a biologist, you know, I look at ecosystems, entire ecosystems and all the pieces and how they fit together, and just the beauty of that creation is incredible. And so when I go to create something, you know, a literary work or a sculpture, you know, I'm a miniaturist and I have this idea in my mind of what I want to do and I work so hard, and either it turns out completely different and terrible than what I wanted and it looks like a 3-year-old did it. No offense to any 3-year-olds who may be watching, or it just explodes in the oven, you know, while it's firing, and all the clay, delicate clay bits that I've made are just gone in a moment. And so I think it's interesting as a creator, someone who creates things, having that grace for yourself to say, I am but a mere mortal, you know, I cannot create in the same way that the ultimate creator creates. But we have this desire for creation because we're made in His image. So we want to express that. And so I really resonate with that short little story of Tolkien's. That's really good. Why do you think he hated allegory so much? I mean, hated is a strong word, but when we're talking about his allegorical works, but I think at one point he even said, I cordially detest allegory, if I'm not wrong. And he was much more about, you know, application. I don't know, and I know we are speculating about what his thoughts may have been, but what are your thoughts on that, Simon?
Yes, so it's the introduction to the later editions of Lord of the Rings, and Tolkien is objecting to those who tried to make the story an allegory of his own times. He does indeed say he cordially detests allegory, and he justifies it by saying that essentially that allegory is an imposition of an interpretation upon the reader, whereas applicability is making a story that so partakes of the quality of reality that it is applicable into whatever situations stand before a reader. So applicability, in a sense, empowers the reader with something that might give insight into whatever situation they face, whereas allegory forces them into a single application. Perhaps to give an example from some of the things we touched on in the previous session, we spoke there of the Nazgul, the Nine, and how their attempt to hold on to life left them trapped in undeath, how they're reaching for power left them as slaves. That's not an allegory because there's no one application. The Nine don't represent communist Russia or Georgian England or anything like that. Rather, it's a general truth painted in quite vivid colours that we can then apply to many situations. In contrast, perhaps, if you look at C.S. Lewis's Narnia Chronicles, where there is a much larger element of allegory. Again, one might contest whether they're truly allegory, but they're at least closer to it. Aslan is definitely representing Jesus Christ, the second figure of the Christian Trinity. He's definitely not representing. To try and read the Narnia Chronicles and say Aslan is Muhammad or Buddha or Madonna would be to do a violence to the story. There's one thing he's meant to represent. So I think that's the key reason Tolkien gives for why he dislikes allegory. And I think that actually feeds into some of this theme of creativity, because allegory, because it only has one sense to it, narrows down the creativity that is available, whereas applicability opens it up. And it's a big theme, I think, in Tolkien, the filling in the details of creation. So in Tolkien's Middle-earth legendarium, the world itself is created by Eru, Ilúvatar, God, and then he sends into it the Ainur, these archangelic spirits, who have the job of giving it form. And they're the ones who take the matter that God has made and turn it into seas and mountains and forests. And then behind them come elves and men. And elves and men are the ones who take stone from the mountains and make buildings, take wood from the forest and make carvings, take water from the rivers and make wine. There's a sense that all of creation is called to be creative, but what it's called to be doing is filling in the details of God's creation. In the same way as perhaps in the Middle Ages, you'd build a cathedral and the architect would build the cathedral, and then the stonemasons would come and carve the stone into its shapes, and then the painters would come and paint it into lifelike colours. And so it is important, I think, for Tolkien to allow space for all of creation to be creative, because the one who gets to set the agenda is God, not us. The architect is the one who gets to say what shape the cathedral will be, not the stone carver, not the painter. And I think that's probably some of the deeper roots for his grumbling on the subject of allegory.
Simon, tell us more about how music factors in Tolkien's work, because I know music is absolutely central to how Ilúvatar essentially delegates that the world be created, right? I would love to hear you expound more on that.
It's very interesting that both Tolkien and C.S. Lewis have music as the means by which the world is made. We might come back to that in a moment. Tolkien's Silmarillion, his sort of backstory to Lord of the Rings, if you like, his mythological creation, opens with something called the Ainur Lindale, the music of the Ainur. And I've got it open here because it's a really beautiful passage, and I won't read the whole thing because that will take a little while, but it's well worth a read. So it opens, "There was Eru, the one, who in Ardar is called Ilúvatar, and he made first the Ainur, the holy ones, that were the offspring of his thought, and they were with him before aught else was made. And he spoke to them, propounding to them themes of music, and they sang before him, and he was glad. And it came to pass that Ilúvatar called together all the Ainur and declared to them a mighty theme, unfolding to them things greater and more wonderful than he had yet revealed. And the glory of its beginning and the splendour of its end amazed the Ainur, so that they bowed before Ilúvatar and were silent. And Ilúvatar said to them, of the theme that I have declared to you, I will now that ye make in harmony together a great music. And since I have kindled you with the flame imperishable, you shall show forth your powers in adorning this theme, each with his own thoughts and devices, if he will." So the story starts with the Creator making a heavenly orchestra of these holy ones, angels, we would say. And they produce a great music, each in their own way, each with their own instrument, on a theme, on a music set forth by the Creator. And the music is great and beautiful, and at the end of it, he says, let these things be, and the world comes into being. And all the history of the world is then the unfolding of the story that was told in that music. Now, there's a lot of depth to that image, but part of it is helping us understand how creativity works, I think, because we often have an idea of creativity, especially in the modern West, that emphasizes independence. Creativity is me putting my thoughts and imaginations into form. But for Tolkien, creativity, at least healthy creativity, is not like being a soloist, but like being in an orchestra. You have your instrument, your gift, and everybody else has theirs. And you need to play according to the theme, according to what the conductor is saying. If the third bassoon wants to go off and play their own piece, it will make discord, and it will potentially spoil the music. And in fact, in Tolkien's image, this is how he tells the story of what in Christian thought is called the fall of the angels. That is the idea of the first appearance of evil. So he writes, as the theme progressed, it came into the heart of Melkor to interweave matters of his own imagining that were not in accord with the theme of Iluvatar, for he sought therein to increase the power and glory of the part assigned to himself. Skipping forward a bit. The air was disturbed and the music of the Ainur faltered, and the discord of Melkor spread ever wider, and the melodies which had been heard before foundered in a sea of turbulent sound. When somebody in the orchestra tries to do their own thing, it messes it up for everybody else. In the end, Iluvatar takes the discord, the noise that Melkor is making, and starts weaving it into his own music. So weaving music around the loud blowing horns and clashing cymbals, so that it again becomes a thing of beauty. And that's a part of the picture, I think, of redemption in the story of the world. But I think music speaks to that sense of being part of a greater whole. That creativity is derived and delegated, and therefore in a sense cooperative. It's not just me doing my own thing, it's me colouring in the structure that somebody else has made. It's me playing as part of an orchestra. But it's also me bringing my instrument to the music. The Ainur weren't all singing the same note, they weren't all playing the same piece, they weren't all playing the same instrument. Each was bringing their own music. And in the same way, when they start actually shaping the world, each of them brings their own set of gifts. One shapes the mountains, one shapes the plants and living things, one shapes the seas, one shapes the wind. It's a very strong stream of thought, again in Tolkien, that everybody has their own thing to contribute. Every Niggle has a leaf. What you need to do is play your instrument in accordance with the conductor's direction, not start trying to play somebody else's piece and not start trying to be the conductor. So I think that's some of the power of this image of music in Tolkien.
And I love how that image of music as such a powerful creative entity plays itself out in the story, right? Like when the hobbits are stuck in the Barrow Downs and Tom Bombadil comes and he's essentially just singing, and it dispels the darkness there. He's actually singing, you could say, in harmony with the music that's at the core of creation, or even something simple. And I know we touched on Sam last time, but Sam, in the Tower of Cirith Ungol, and Frodo's been captured and all hope is lost, and he sits down and he just sings a song. And on a casual reading of Tolkien, that's beautiful and it's powerful, but on a deeper reading of Tolkien, you actually see that Sam is sort of in line with Iluvatar's musical theme there, even in that. So like just the richness and the complexity of that thought in Tolkien really makes reading Lord of the Rings a more powerful experience for me, just even like knowing that, what you're talking about.
Thanks for tuning in to the Faith and Lit podcast. That's all the time we have for this episode, but be sure to join us next week as we continue our conversation on Tolkien's creativity. Keep reading, keep creating, every little leaf counts.